Hello and welcome to this video on Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney has been described as one of our greatest poets. He's an Irish poet who was born and educated in Northern Ireland, although he stressed that he was Irish rather than British. And we can see that in this poem because a lot of his poems are about the landscape of Ireland, and quite a few of them relate to the bogs in Ireland. So often we found in his poetry that it deals with nature and the local surroundings and the setting of Ireland. Now, some of his poetry was exploring about the troubles in Ireland. However, in this one particular poem, Seamus Heaney has said himself that it isn't about the troubles in Ireland. However, some people have gone on to think that it might be, but he's said categorically it wasn't about the troubles in Ireland. Now, before we look at the poem in detail, we're just going to think about this idea of what a storm is and think about the impact it has on us as people and the feelings it creates, because that's what poetry is about. It's about exploring ideas, but about feelings as well. And this particular poem is about feelings and about the ideas of an oncoming storm. A storm arrives on the island, okay, and we see how the people behave, and we see how people react to the storm. So here are just several images that you can see the massive impact that storms can have on us and how they can disrupt our whole lives. Okay, Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. We are prepared. We build our houses squat, sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. The wizened earth has never troubled us with hay. So as you can see, there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost, nor are there any trees which might prove company when it blows full blast. You know what I mean? Leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale, so that you listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it pummels your house too. But there are no trees, no natural shelter. You might think that the sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. But no. When it begins, the flung spray hits the very windows, spits like a tame cat, turns savage. We sit tight while wind dives and strafes invisibly. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded with the empty air. Strange, but a huge nothing that we fear. Now, the poem Storm on the Island is a fairly straightforward poem. We can see that people are getting ready and getting prepared for the storm at the beginning. And at the beginning, they say that they didn't have much to worry because their houses were built squat, okay, and they built them with the best slate that they could. But they didn't have to worry about things blowing away that much because it talks about there were no stacks because of the hay, and it suggests that the land isn't very fertile. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about stooks and stacks, is that it's something to hold hay so it can dry out. So they don't have to worry about any of those things. But also, there are no trees. And so actually, on this island that they're talking about, they are very, very exposed to the wind and the storm when it comes. And we can see as we go through the poem that as it goes further, that there are no trees and no shelter. So they're kind of on their own against the elements. And it says that you might think the sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs, and that idea that the sea would help protect them, but clearly it doesn't. And it joins in a way, because it talks about attacking the windows and flungs the spray at the very windows. And then we get at the end that really it is a huge nothing that we fear. So this whole preparation of a storm is kind of a little bit deflated by the time we get to the end of the poem, because it seems like it's a big thing that's going to happen, the storm on the island, but actually it isn't, and it's something quite small and insignificant. Right, we're going to just have a look at some of the images in the poem. Now, the starting off is we have this idea about the houses, how they build them small and squat, and this idea almost as if man is kind of inferior, and so this idea kind of like hiding against the way things are. And so we see that from the beginning. So this storm on the island, okay, we know it's coming, we get that sense of it coming, but people are kind of prepared, and what they've done is try to make themselves small to kind of hide away from things. But then also we hear about how the earth is wizened, and so how actually the land itself isn't really supportive. All right, and what we see in the poem is this idea that nature is almost against man. So the earth isn't supporting by helping plants grow, and also the fact that the sea isn't helping and protecting. So it's almost like man is against nature, and we're seeing big, powerful things and small mankind and humans. So we're seeing this whole idea, big and small. And in this poem, we have this idea of size, of things being big, okay, and things being small. So everything else is big and mankind is small. And then right towards the end of the poem, we get this idea of spits like a tame cat, which is a really, really interesting simile, because it's that idea of, it seems to be, this whole storm seems to be such a big, powerful thing, but actually a tame cat, it's almost like, as it says at the end of the poem, a huge nothing. And so it's almost like nature can be both big and small at the same time. And we're seeing this idea of size. And we see this in the Romantic poets, because the Romantic poets have this idea of nature and the idea of the sublime. And that is that nature can be both beautiful and positive, but also fearful and scary. So what we're seeing in the poem is that duality of nature, that nature isn't something simple. It is something quite complex, and it can be something quite big and scary, but also it can be something quite safe and not scary. A tame cat in particular. Now, just looking at the language in a bit more detail. So, the verbs that the writer uses to describe this storm is quite violent. So, it pummels, exploding, bombarding. So, you can see that we've got lots of violence in this. And the actions of the storm itself are incredibly violent, okay, and attacking the people on this island. However, when we get to the end of the poem, it's like a huge nothing. And it's almost like the storm is just overly dramatic in the poem. And when you get to it, it's not that bad. And so we could say that the language kind of gives us that sense of unpredictableness about storms. That yes, they can be destructive, but you don't know. And when you're in the middle of it, it sounds noisy, it sounds terrible. It is only afterwards that you realise, well, it isn't that bad. But that's where we're fooled with the use of language in here. And throughout the poem, we see this, lots of violent imagery and violent language that's used in the poem. And you can see why some people think that this poem is about the troubles in Ireland, because it refers to war. However, I would say that it really is about looking at the relationship and how man views nature. It's almost like it's fearful and it's scared of it and it's unhappy about it. And that's what's reflected in the language. So all the language is aggressive and it's attacking, whereas actually it doesn't do any damage at the end of it. Now, if we look at the form of the poem, it's quite interesting because we only have one stanza, which when we tend to see stanzas like this, it tends to be used for things like sonnets. And when it's one sonnet, it tends to be more about a kind of obsession, about one idea. And in here, we could say that we see that in the poem. All they are bothered about is the storm. And we're seeing that in that obsession. It's almost like how mankind is obsessed with nature and obsessed with what the storm could bring. And so hence why we've got that whole one stanza. It is there to show the obsession that there is around this poem. Now, the other thing about this poem is it's a dramatic monologue. And so it's told like a story and it's spoken to us in a way. So we're watching things unfold as we go along. Now, what this does is it makes it more inclusive and it makes it feel like we're part of the conversation that's going on. Okay, we're going to have a look at what is Heaney kind of teaching us. So he's teaching us about our relationship with nature and the kind of the complicated aspect of nature, that nature can be a bit like the Romantics were talking about, this idea that nature can be both something feared but also something that can be enjoyed and admired. And we can see that kind of fear at the beginning, but also at the end that it's a huge nothing. We also see how people unite together to fight a common enemy. And the way that the storm is described is it's described like it's a war and it's like a battle, and that people have to be prepared as they fight it and they get used to this idea. And we can see that with the use of the pronouns constantly in the poem itself. We did this, we did that. But also this poem is about our relationship with the world. And notice how these people live on this island, but they don't actually use it. And so it's got a sense of how maybe we've forgotten about how we used to use the land and how we used to be part of the land. And it said how it wizened, and so that they couldn't grow things on this island, which suggests that in a way we've kind of lost touch, because it's quite a natural thing to grow things and to plant things, yet these people haven't. And so what we could say in this poem is it's almost like we've forgotten about nature and our relationship with nature, and how actually nature can be used and to help us and to make our lives better. And it's interesting how in the poem it talks about how there are no trees to help and the sea isn't company. It treats every part of nature as if it's something against and not actually there to help and support. So we certainly see that with the Industrial Revolution, and this is a poem that's fairly modern, so it's not really talking about the Industrial Revolution, but it's talking about possibly how, because of technology and the way that the modern world has worked, that we've lost our connection with nature and we've forgotten how to use nature, how to interact. And so hence that's why we get the fear of a storm. It is a scary thing because we're not used to nature. We've forgotten that. And we can see that there's an element of culture that we've got there about how we live our lives. And this is very much a very remote. It's not interacting with nature. It's very separate with nature. So the culture that we live in. And we can see about power, how in a way nature has all the power in this. And actually we see at the end, but it doesn't have. And it's got that interesting idea about the dynamics, because possibly is that man feels that he's too powerful. And we need something like this storm to kind of remind us that we're not the only thing in existence, that there are other things around us. And there's that sense of history going back to the past. You know, we're talking about thinking about rural landscape and thinking about how the landscape can help us and how it can support us and how it could be helping our lives make it better. Now, other things to think about is where else do we see this in the poem? Why does this poem have this stance? And what is the poet aiming to do? And one of the things I would say, certainly about Seamus Heaney, is that he is very, very interested about nature and about our connection with nature and how we interact with nature. And he doesn't see it as something separate, as something that kind of is kind of going to be an attack against us, but more that our relationship with nature just needs to be redefined, and that we've forgotten our roots and how actually we are natural, we are part of that landscape. And the other thing is to think about what was going on at that time. You know, as he was writing this poem, you know, the world was changing, modernizing, okay, was something happening in the world that kind of impacts on this. So what are the connections that we can see in the poem then? Okay, so the things that we can connect to, so the power of nature. Now we've seen that a number of times in a number of different poems. We see that in exposure. We see it in, for example, the prelude, extract from the prelude, and we see it also with Ozymandias. Okay, we've got then the power of expectations. What we expect is not the reality. And that again links to exposure, because these soldiers went to war and the reality of war is not what they expected it to be. And we see that in About Remains as well, where the soldiers are all happy and the expectations of war was it's a positive experience, but then we see the reality and the impact it has on it. And we see the power of people, of what people can do together, which kind of links into the poem London, because in that poem we see what happens when everybody's thinking the same thing, how destructive it can be. Whereas here, when everybody's working together, they can be quite a strong unit. So we can see an opposite of the power of people. We see in this poem the conflict between man and nature, and we can see that in other poems, such as Extract from the Prelude, and we can see about Ozymandias as well, in the fact that nature in a way beats man. Here, it doesn't quite beat man, okay? It seems worse than it actually is. Then we see the conflict between expectation and reality, and also the conflict between the landscape and the weather. Now, if we look in this poem, it's quite interesting how the weather is the thing that's attacking, but actually the rest of the landscape isn't. It's kind of quite what we say passive. It's not involved. It's not helping at all, but then again, it's not really attacking. It's just doing nothing. And that's why I tend to think that this poem is more about our relationship. You know, it's a two-way thing with relationships. It isn't just about we take. We have to be part of it in that process. And that could be the thing that we've got in this poem itself. Okay, we're just going to go through the questions then. So just pause the video and just see if you can answer these questions. And when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll go through the answers. Okay, let's just go through the answers then. So, number one, how did they build their houses to make them prepared for the storm? Well, very, very simply, they built them squat and they sink the walls in rock and they made them with good slate. Number two, what's happened on the island in the past? Well, by the line, this wizened earth has never troubled us, gives a suggestion that they've never had any problems before on the island. Number three, what do they not have to protect their houses? Well, that's trees. Number four, what sea is the word used to describe how some people might view the sea? And that's company. Number five, what bee is the verb used to describe the way that the storm attacks the houses? And that's bombards, bombarded. Number six, what H and N describes the storm at the end of the poem? That's a huge nothing. What key pronoun is used throughout the poem? Okay, well, we've got two key pronouns, but we tend to say we on this one because it starts and ends with the poem. But you could also use the pronoun you. What, number eight, similarly, does the writer use to show how the storm attacks the windows? Well, spits like a tame cat. And finally, what piece of alliteration is used to suggest peace and calm? Well, we've got space is a salvo. That's it for our quick little look at Storming the Island. Please do check out our other YouTube videos.